He never lost a game of one-on-one. Not once in 11 years. The number the fence still argues about is 203, 203 straight wins with no rematches granted and no exceptions made for size. He stood 5'4" in sneakers. Grown men who cleared 6 feet walked off that blacktop shaking their heads, and some of them never came back to run that court again. Of those 203 wins, more than half ended with the other man sitting flat on the pavement, untouched, just fooled. The regulars had a rule nobody ever wrote down anywhere. You did not pick the small guy last. You did not pick him at all if you could help it, because picking him meant losing, and losing to him meant the whole block would know about it by sundown. They called him the Needle, because that was what he did to you, thread by thread, until there was nothing left of your defense to hold together. Nobody outside 3 blocks of Vance Street knew his real name. Inside those 3 blocks, his real name was the only thing that mattered, and on a humid Saturday afternoon in July of 1988, a stranger who had never heard either name picked him forth for a 2-on-2, laughed at the height of him in front of 30 people, and told him to go home, kid. He had no idea what he had just done. His name was Muggsy Bogues. Subscribe now, because what the Needle is about to do to the stranger who just picked him forth is not a story you want to walk into halfway through. I ran Winners Court on Vance Street for the better part of 2 decades, so I watched most of what happened next unfold with my own eyes. The court sat wedged between a laundromat and a chain-link fence, with a hole cut in the corner where the kids climbed through, instead of walking the long way around. 2 rims, no nets, just chains that rattled loud when a shot went clean through. The asphalt buckled near half-court from a tree root nobody ever bothered to dig out. On a good Saturday you had 30, sometimes 40 people stacked along that fence, radios propped on the hood of somebody's Buick, folding chairs dragged out from apartments upstairs. The winner stayed on. That was the entire economy of that block. You won, you stayed on the court. You lost, you sat down in the shade and waited for next, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for the whole afternoon. If the run was good enough, then nobody wanted to give up the court. There was a hierarchy on Vance Street older than most of the players who upheld it. You earned your spot in the rotation. You did not talk yourself into it. Strangers came through that block more than people from outside ever guessed. Mostly kids from other neighborhoods looking to test themselves against a court with a reputation, and most of them left with a story they told differently depending on how much pride they had left afterward. Nobody had heard the name Muggsy Bogues outside those 3 blocks by 1988, and that suited everybody on Vance Street just fine. A legend that traveled brought traffic. A legend that stayed quiet kept the court exactly the way the regulars liked it. Vance Street had produced 3 players before Muggsy Bogues who briefly carried some version of that same weight, a lefty named Cortez in the 70s who eventually blew out a knee, a shooting guard everybody called Fox, who took a scholarship out of state and never came back to visit, and a bruising post player who simply aged out of the run sometime in the early 80s. None of them had held the fence's attention the way Muggsy Bogues eventually would, and none of them had done it standing 5'4" in a crowd of grown men twice their size. Muggsy Bogues had been coming to that court since he was 8 years old, dragging a ball half his own size behind him because he could not properly palm it yet. He was always the smallest kid in whatever group showed up, and for years that meant exactly what you would expect. He got knocked down running for loose balls. He got boxed out by kids 2 grades ahead of him. He got picked last often enough that he started showing up an hour before anybody else just to get extra shots up before the real games began. His father used to stand at the fence some evenings after work, still in his coveralls, not saying much of anything, just watching his son get knocked down and get back up, over and over, until the light went orange and it was time to go home for dinner. By 10 years old, Muggsy Bogues had stopped getting knocked down nearly as often. By 13, the older guys on the block had quietly stopped underestimating him out loud, though plenty of them still did it in their heads every single time a new face showed up asking who the short kid was. He worked the handle for hours after everyone else had gone home, dragging a milk crate out to the corner of the court, setting up a row of empty soda cans as cones, running the same crossover into the same spin move until the streetlights buzzed on overhead and his mother leaned out the 3rd-floor window calling him up for dinner. Nobody taught him that particular discipline. Nobody had to. He had decided early, on his own, that the only way a 5'4" kid survived Winners Court long-term was if the ball never left his hands long enough for anybody to prove he could not survive it. By 17, Muggsy Bogues was the best passer on that entire block, and it took most people years longer to notice that fact than it should have, because they were too busy watching him score to notice how he was setting everyone else up along the way. His handle was tight enough that defenders grabbed at nothing but air and stumbled into each other trying to recover. He read a double team forming a full step before it fully closed. He drew two defenders toward him constantly and found the third man standing wide open under the rim so reliably that guys eventually stopped switching onto him at all, because switching onto him meant somebody else on your side was about to get embarrassed instead of you. His whole game was built on geometry, not size. He always knew exactly where the gap was before it opened, the way some people can feel rain coming before the sky changes color. His signature move was an inside-out crossover into a dead-stop hesitation, the exact same move he had drilled alone against a row of soda cans, a decade earlier under those same streetlights. He sold the drive hard, got the defender's hips fully turned and committed, then snapped the ball back across his body and froze completely for a quarter of a second at the very top of his dribble. That quarter second was the entire trick. Grown men lunged at nothing during that pause and landed hard on the pavement while Muggsy Bogues calmly walked past them for an uncontested layup. The old heads on the fence had a name for that pause. They called it the grave, because that was exactly where you buried a defender's ankles for good, in front of everybody who would ever remind him about it. Of his 203 straight wins, the count on the fence put well over 100 of them ending with somebody sitting on the blacktop, completely untouched, just fooled clean out of their shoes. 2 months before that July afternoon, a 6'6" college transfer named Perkins had shown up on Vance Street specifically wanting a reputation, the kind that travels fast if you build it against the right opponent. He picked Muggsy Bogues for one-on-one on purpose, the way strangers occasionally did, assuming a short opponent meant a free possession and an easy story to tell afterward. Perkins scored the first 2 buckets on pure size alone, backing Muggsy Bogues down under the rim with his shoulder, the way you back down somebody half your weight. Muggsy Bogues adjusted by the third possession, started fronting him instead of trailing, digging the ball loose before Perkins could settle his feet, and the game turned into 11 straight buckets running the other direction. Final score was 21-2, and Perkins left the court without shaking anybody's hand, his gym bag already halfway to the fence before the last shot even dropped. Word got around the neighborhood fast after that afternoon. Perkins told people at his own gym uptown that the kid had gotten lucky, that the fronting defense was a fluke he would never see again from anybody that size, and for 2 weeks that story held up fine among people who had never actually watched it happen. On Vance Street, if you did not already know the small guy's name walking in, you learned it walking out, usually the hard way. By that summer, the good players from the surrounding blocks had quietly stopped challenging Muggsy Bogues to one-on-one entirely. Winners Court needed fresh challengers to keep the rotation moving, and the regulars had started deliberately avoiding solo matchups with him, sticking instead to full squad games where his advantage got diluted across 4 other bodies on the floor. The fence had started calling it a drought, 3 straight weeks without a single soul stepping up for one-on-one. The Needle sat some Saturdays just waiting on the sideline, ball resting on his hip, nobody willing to put their record on the line against him anymore, not even for bragging rights, not even for the small crowd that always gathered whenever his name got called. 200 miles north, a 19-year-old named Marcus Doyle was busy building a different kind of name for himself on a different kind of circuit. They called him Sky, partly because of what he did to defenders who tried to take a charge against him, going straight over the top of them instead of around, and partly because he had once dunked on 3 separate people during the same weekend tournament and made absolutely certain everybody within earshot heard about it for months afterward. At a tournament in Poughkeepsie that spring, he had reportedly told a referee mid-game that the man guarding him should be embarrassed to even be on the same roster, loud enough that the other team's whole bench heard it clearly from the sideline. And the story had followed him down the circuit ever since, growing a little each time somebody new retold it. Sky carried a record of his own that summer, 71 straight wins in one-on-one spread across 2 different states, and a habit of announcing that number before anybody had bothered to ask him for it. He traveled circuit to circuit all season looking for courts with reputations worth collecting, driving his cousin's Oldsmobile down from a tournament in Albany with a duffel bag in the back seat and a mouth that had not stopped running since he crossed the county line 3 hours earlier. Sky had first heard about Vance Street from a cousin who used to run that block years before, the cousin describing it the exact way people describe places they used to be tough enough to survive. Sky heard the word legend attached to that court and heard absolutely nothing about any particular name attached to it. He rolled up on a Saturday afternoon wearing a tank top 3 sizes too big for the point he was clearly trying to make, dropped his duffel bag against the fence, and looked over the run already in progress the way a man prices out furniture he has already decided he cannot afford to respect. He gave the whole court 30 seconds of actual watching before he opened his mouth. And in those 30 seconds, he never once looked twice at the short kid working the ball calmly near the top of the key, orchestrating half the offense without anybody seeming to notice him doing it. Sky called next with 2 of his own guys already lined up behind him, which was not remotely how Winter's Court operated, but nobody argued the point, because arguing with a stranger that loud on a 90-degree afternoon cost more energy than it was worth to anybody standing in the shade. When the teams got picked for the 2-on-2 that followed, Sky pointed straight at Muggsy Bogues without even glancing at anybody else available. "I'll take the little one," he announced, loud enough for the entire fence to hear clearly over the radios. "Free bucket." Somebody standing near the laundromat door laughed out loud, not at Muggsy Bogues but nervously, the specific way you laugh when you already know something the new guy standing in front of you has absolutely no idea about yet. Ray, standing closest to the fence post that afternoon, did not say a single word yet. He had learned years back that the loud ones always did most of the damage to themselves, given enough rope and enough hot afternoon sun to hang themselves with it. Muggsy Bogues did not answer any of it. He bounced the ball twice against the pavement, checked it in at the top of the key, and waited in silence. Sky kept right on talking anyway, because talking was clearly half of why he had driven 3 hours to get here in the first place. He asked how old the kid was. He said something about a junior varsity bench somewhere. He told Muggsy Bogues he should be home doing homework instead of playing with grown men on a real court. "Somebody call his mother," Sky said, grinning wide at his own joke. "Go home, kid, before you get embarrassed in front of your whole neighborhood." The regulars along the fence had gone quiet in that specific way. That meant everybody present already knew precisely how this particular afternoon was going to end, and were only sticking around now to watch it happen slowly, in real time, so they could tell it properly later. One of the older men, a guy named Ray who had been running the chains on that court since before Muggsy Bogues could even walk unassisted, leaned over toward the man standing next to him and said just loud enough to carry across 10 feet of blacktop, "This boy is about to learn something today that no cousin ever told him about. He did not say it to be cruel about it. He said it the exact way you warn a stranger standing a little too close to a hot stove they have not noticed yet. Before Sky learns that name, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and state below. Every neighborhood has a court like Vance Street somewhere in it." Sky asked one more time what the kid's actual name was, mostly out of habit at that point. The kind of question you toss at an opponent you already fully intend to forget about by the following morning. Muggsy Bogues looked directly at him for the first time since the teams had been called out loud. "Just play," he said. 2 words, nothing more offered on top of it, and he turned calmly back toward the key without waiting for a response. Sky laughed at that too, called it cute in front of everybody listening, and walked off to his own spot to check the ball in himself rather than wait around for anybody to pass it to him properly. Watching from where I stood against the fence that afternoon, I already had a fairly good sense of what kind of hour this was about to become for Marcus Doyle, and I will admit plainly that some of us standing there were looking forward to it more than we probably should have been. If you have ever sized somebody up in 4 seconds flat and judged their entire game off the first 4 inches you could see of them standing in front of you, you already know exactly what comes next in a story like this one. The ball went up at last, and Sky's team scored the first bucket clean off a simple pick, and Roll his side had clearly run 100 times before, while Muggsy Bogues' own teammate lost his man for just long enough to give up the easy look. Sky pointed hard at the rim after the score dropped and stared straight at Muggsy Bogues like the entire afternoon had already been settled after one single possession. On the very next trick down, the ball found its way to Muggsy Bogues at the top of the key, almost by accident, one of his teammates simply clearing out of instinct the way you clear space for somebody you trust with it. Sky slid over immediately to guard him personally, chest out, already grinning. "Big mistake, kid," Sky said, dropping low into a defensive stance built for somebody twice Muggsy Bogues' size. Muggsy Bogues took one hard dribble left. Sky bit down on it completely, his weight already committed fully toward the sideline before the fake had even finished developing. Muggsy Bogues snapped the ball back right in one smooth motion. "Wait!" Froze for that same exact quarter second the fence had nicknamed the grave a decade earlier, and walked past him clean for an uncontested layup while Sky was still busy recovering his balance from a crossover that had barely traveled 2 full feet across the pavement. The fence made the sound it always made for that particular move, half laughter, half low groan, the sound of people who had watched it land 100 times before and still somehow enjoyed the 101st. Sky did not laugh along this time. He set his jaw tight, called for the ball harder on the next possession, and tried to bully his way straight to the rim on 3 consecutive drives in a row. Muggsy Bogues gave ground willingly on the first attempt, absorbed the contact without flinching, and forced a clean miss off the back iron simply by staying square instead of reaching in and fouling. On the second attempt, he read the spin move coming a full beat before Sky had even finished turning into it, and poked the ball loose clean, no contact at all, nothing but ball. On the third drive, Sky tried going over him completely instead, the exact same move that had earned him his nickname up north 2 summers earlier, rising hard for a dunk attempt over a defender giving up a full 8 inches of height in the process. Muggsy Bogues never left the ground to meet him. He stayed planted, timed the release perfectly, and got just enough fingertip on the ball on the way up to knock the shot off its line entirely, sending it clanging off the back rim as Sky came down hard. Visibly more rattled by the miss itself than by anything that had happened to him in the 2 possessions before it. The fence had shifted by now from murmuring quietly among themselves to fully leaning forward against the chain link, the kind of hush where you could actually hear sneakers squeaking against blacktop between every single play. By the middle of the third full game, Sky had gone almost completely silent, which told everybody standing along that fence far more than any amount of trash talk ever could have. He was burning twice the energy Muggsy Bogues was spending chasing constantly instead of reading the floor, forcing up bad shots instead of simply finding good ones the way his opponent kept doing effortlessly, possession after possession. Muggsy Bogues barely raised his voice above a normal conversation the entire time, calling quietly for the ball, calling out screens for his teammate, moving across that blacktop like the whole afternoon was costing him nothing at all. The fence had seen this exact shape of afternoon unfold before, more than once over the years. And everybody leaning against that chain link already understood that Sky's next real lesson was coming straight out of that quarter-second pause buried inside Muggsy Bogues' crossover, whether he happened to be ready for it yet or not. Sky tried switching defensive assignments next, guarding somebody else entirely for a possession or two, hoping a little distance might cool his frustration down some. It did not help him at all. Muggsy Bogues found him right back on offense anyway, calling isolation on that exact matchup specifically now, the same quiet request repeated each time down the floor. "Get me Sky," he would say, and his teammates obliged without ever bothering to ask why out loud. 3 straight possessions, Muggsy Bogues attacked precisely the matchup Sky had demanded for free a full hour earlier. And 3 straight times that same crossover into the same hesitation left Sky, either grabbing at empty air or stumbling backward trying to recover a balance he had already fully lost the moment the ball snapped back the other way. On the 4th attempt, Sky tried something genuinely different at last, refusing to bite on the crossover at all this time, staying flat-footed and square, daring Muggsy Bogues with his whole posture to just pull up and shoot over him instead of driving. Muggsy Bogues read that adjustment in under half a second, the same way he had read everything else that entire afternoon, and instead of settling for the jumper, he drove hard and direct into what should have been Sky's help defense rotating over. There was no help arriving at all. Sky's own teammate had drifted too far out of position chasing an assignment on the far side of the court, and Muggsy Bogues split the gap clean for an and one finish, absorbing contact on the way up that sent Sky stumbling backward hard into the chain-link fence itself. The fence roared loud enough that somebody's radio nearly bounced clean off the hood of the Buick parked beside it. Sky picked himself back up slowly, breathing hard now for the first time all afternoon, both hands braced on his knees for a long second before he finally straightened all the way up. He looked at Muggsy Bogues differently than he had looked at him all day long. The mockery completely gone out of his face now, replaced by something closer to genuine attention, like he was finally watching the actual game in front of him instead of narrating his own version of it out loud. "What's your name?" Sky asked again, much quieter this time, no grin left anywhere behind the question. "Muggsy Bogues," he said simply. Just that, nothing added on top of it. Sky repeated the name under his breath like a man trying to place something familiar he could not quite locate yet in his memory. Somebody standing near the fence, the same old head named Ray who had watched this exact scene build itself a dozen times over the years, finally said it loud enough for Sky to hear clean across the key. "That's the needle man, 203 straight wins and counting. You picked the wrong free bucket walking onto this block today." Sky did not answer right away. He looked hard at Muggsy Bogues, then over at the fence full of people who had all known this particular outcome long before the very first ball ever went up that afternoon, then back at Muggsy Bogues one more time. Something in his face shifted visibly, the exact same shift you see in anybody finally realizing the story they walked confidently into is not remotely the one they thought they were about to tell their cousins back home. He put both hands up slowly, not quite in surrender, more like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying the whole drive down without ever realizing how heavy it actually was. "My bad," Sky said, and it sounded genuine for the first time all day long. I didn't know who you were. Muggsy Bogues just shrugged, no anger anywhere in the gesture, the exact same flat calm he had carried through every single possession since the opening tip. Now you do, he said, and reached his hand out across the space between them. Sky shook it, and something about that particular handshake looked entirely different from the ones you usually see following a blowout, less like a formality being observed, and more like an apology quietly being paid back in the only real currency that Court had ever dealt in. They ended up running 2 more full games that same afternoon on the same 2 teams, and Sky, to his genuine credit, stopped talking almost entirely and started asking real questions between possessions instead. Wanting to know exactly how Muggsy Bogues had read that double team so early every single time, wanting to know the actual mechanics behind that pause buried inside the crossover. Muggsy Bogues answered him plainly. No showmanship left in it anywhere, the way a craftsman finally explains a tool to somebody who has become genuinely curious enough at last to actually ask him about it properly. By the time the sun finally dropped behind the laundromat roof that evening, Sky had lost every single game he played against the Needle that day, and he stayed on anyway. Well past the point where most strangers with any pride left would have already pulled themselves off that court and back into their cousin's Oldsmobile. He asked, before he finally left for good that night, whether he could come back the following Saturday. Muggsy Bogues told him the court stayed open to absolutely anybody who showed up, ready to actually learn something from it. Ray, still leaning against that same fence, said afterward that it was the nicest thing he had ever personally heard the Needle say to somebody who had picked him 4th that same afternoon. Muggsy Bogues kept his streak fully alive through the rest of that summer and well into the fall, and the number on Vance Street eventually climbed past 230 before anybody along that fence bothered to keep an exact count of it again. He never once left the neighborhood chasing anything bigger, never chased a bigger court or a bigger name for himself anywhere else. People asked him about that decision more than once over the years that followed, why a talent like his had stayed parked on one single blacktop between a laundromat and a chain-link fence his entire life, when plenty of scouts eventually did come looking. He gave the same answer nearly every single time anybody asked him directly. This is where they learn the lesson, he said. Somebody has to stay here to teach it properly. A neighborhood paper ran a short piece on Vance Street 11 years later, mostly about the court itself getting resurfaced by the city after decades of complaints about that same buckled tree root near Half Court. The reporter asked around about the old rumors of an unbeaten streak, and an older man leaning on the new fence told her the number had eventually reached past 400 before Muggsy Bogues finally lost a game on purpose to a 12-year-old kid working up the nerve to challenge him for the very first time. The reporter asked if that story was true. The old man just smiled and said some numbers on that block were never really about the number at all. Sky came back the very next Saturday exactly like he had promised, and kept coming back most summers after that one, driving down from wherever the circuit had carried him that particular season just to run Winter's Court on Vance Street one more time before summer ended. He never called anybody a free bucket again out loud, not once, and whenever younger players eventually asked him about the scar on his pride from that one July afternoon, he told the story on himself before anybody else standing around ever got the chance to tell it for him first. He eventually brought his own younger cousin down to Vance Street a few summers later, introduced him to Ray at the fence, and told the kid flatly that this was the one court in 3 states where he had ever been taught anything worth keeping. How many times have you sized somebody up in 4 seconds flat and decided you already knew exactly how the whole story was going to end before it even started? How many times were you the one getting sized up instead, standing there a foot shorter or a full step slower while somebody else quietly decided your entire ceiling before you had even touched the ball once? Both of those people are reading this comment section right now, and both of them already know exactly which one they were standing on Vance Street that particular afternoon, whether they want to admit it out loud in front of everybody watching or not. The lesson was never really about the height at all. It was never really about the crossover either, not underneath it. It was always about what happens the exact moment you decide a person's whole story off the first 4 inches you can see of them standing in front of you. And what happens afterward, once the rest of that story finally gets its own chance to play out in full view, right in front of everyone who doubted it.